بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين أما بعد فقد قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه صدق رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So last week we discussed Hassan, what did you discuss last week? Brilliant.
You asking me?
Asking everyone.
Okay, so it was different things that you value in life.
Gratitude. Okay, mashallah, very good. Different things that you value in life. Mashallah.
How to do tawbah, how to ask for forgiveness.
That was a week before that.
Oh, that was a week before.
Last week was gratitude, yes. Alhamdulillah. So one verse of the Qur'an we mentioned was وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. That if you try and do ta'addi, if you try and encompass one of the blessings of Allah. So the Qur'an verse mentions وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ, that if you try and encompass just one blessing of Allah, then لَا تُحْصُوهَا, you won't be able to encompass it. That's one of the things we went through. And then everybody mentioned one blessing. So one person said one thing, someone else said another thing, and we all mentioned a blessing. And then we went that if each of those blessings, we went into them and looked at them properly, we could speak about every blessing for so long. So any blessing that we have. So this week inshallah we talk about the Qur'an, which is one blessing which is very often underrated, especially within ourselves. How much do we value it? How much do we appreciate the fact that we have the Qur'an? So firstly, one of the most important things to realize about the Qur'an is that it's very direct, and it's between us and Allah. Is one of those medians that we can, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He sends a kalam. So now, for example, a way for us to understand that is that if we want to achieve something in life, if we want to get something, so wherever we are, whichever kind of field we're in, we'll have somebody above us, we'll have some kind of relationship. So if we're working, then we'll have a relationship with our employer. If we're still living at home, we'll have a relation with our parents. And however we want to resolve that issue, whenever we have an issue, we'll go to the people who are in charge of us. If we buy something and we don't know how to use it, we'll ask the person who made it, who created it. So we'll always have this kind of relationship. Now, if at work, we were at work, and then suddenly the chief executive of the company came in, and usually it's a very big company and you hardly ever get the chance to meet him. Now he came and he gave us advice. He gave, this junior apprentice, he starts giving him advice on what to do, what job to apply for, how he should do work, who he should try and impress, who's really got the power. So he tries to tell this to somebody very low down. So we can see the difference in status. You understand? So in the same way, when we get a message from Allah, we get a revelation from Allah, directly from Allah, and He tells us exactly how we should be living our lives. Now, from all of the people in the world, Allah is the one being who knows how we're meant to be living our lives best. And then He sends a whole book of instructions on how we should be living our lives. And then we realize how we can improve our lives based on the guidance which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. So this is one really easy way for us to appreciate that. I mean, we couldn't really get lower as a slave. Nowadays slaves don't really exist in the world that much. Not that we can't go out and buy one ourselves anyway. But generally we don't really know slaves to exist anymore. So nobody is known as a slave generally in the world. But our relationship with Allah is as a slave. I mean, the way that we perceive Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to do whatever He tells us to do. So His authority over us couldn't be greater as a master. And then, now if we were to consider our relationship with our employer, or our parents, or somebody else who we take advice from, and we ask them for advice, and then we value that advice because of their authority, because of their position, then we'd appreciate it, we'd take it on board. If the person writing our exam gave us advice on how to answer the questions in the exam, we'd value it a lot. If we knew somebody on our board, on the AQA or Edexcel board, and he's telling us what's going to come on the exam at the end of the year, then we're going to take his advice very seriously. So it's that knowledge and that authority. So now Allah couldn't be in more authority at all, and we couldn't be lower down. We couldn't be, nothing comes lower than a slave. So that's our relation with Allah, and then Allah sends us guidance and how to act upon that guidance. So Allah gives us how to live our lives so that we're successful in this life. One very important thing we know about the Qur'an is that it comes down tawaturan. Who knows what that means?
Sequence. Hierarchy.
Tawatur. So hadith. So. Sorry?
From one person to another.
From one person to another. So generally, when you look at a hadith, that's a much better answer than what any of you get. You make some kind of sense. So a hadith, we'll find it has a chain, isn't it? So then we decide whether it's authentic or whether it's made up or whether it's half made up. So we have some kind of chain for a hadith. For the Qur'an, There's no need for a chain, because from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, when he said it, then there was thousands of people already writing it down and recording it. So generally when we come across a hadith in any kind of hadith book, we'll always wonder about its authenticity. How authentic is this hadith? And some hadith will get to this level of having thousands of or hundreds of people in each generation. But the Qur'an, without any doubt, every verse of it was recorded by the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, fully, right at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and then passed down to the generation below them and all the way to us. And then we all have very sound chains in the Qur'an, all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, and then that goes through Jibreel back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the exact word of Allah we have before us, which is in itself a great blessing. But with the hadith, sometimes we don't know whether it's actually what the Prophet ﷺ, whether it's exactly what the Prophet ﷺ. With the Qur'an, we have no doubt that all the way from us, we know exactly what Allah is trying to tell us, and the exact message which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to get to us. So this is something that really, we have to appreciate the greatness, firstly, of the kalam which Allah is saying, and also how direct that is. And that's something we can appreciate. And our ability to appreciate comes in different ways. So as Muslims, what we have the ability to do is to have a relationship with the Qur'an. So we benefit from the Qur'an in different ways. So many of us simply will recite the Qur'an, so we read it. Now even if you don't understand what it means, reciting the Qur'an has certain benefits. So if you recite it, then some of us will realize that by reciting it, you'll feel a certain spirituality, you'll feel a certain closeness to Allah, you'll feel as if you're talking to someone, you'll feel a certain peace just by reading it without even understanding it. So this is what we realize firstly from the Qur'an, that just by reciting it, we get this closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even if we don't recite it and we listen to somebody else, so sometimes, especially when Allah mentions in the Qur'an, He talks about Qur'an al-Fajr, that the recitation of the Qur'an at Fajr time. So if we get the chance, we go to the mosque at Fajr time and we listen to the Qur'an, and that has a special effect on its own, just by listening to it. And generally, even if it's not during Salah, just by listening to the Qur'an, we notice different effects. Even in certain hadith, we notice that by listening to certain things, it has a certain effect on us and on the way that we perceive the Qur'an. And then generally, just by reading the Qur'an, we notice that we ourselves as individuals, we connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is one of the things that we achieve. And then if we start understanding the Qur'an, and we make sure that we learn Arabic and we understand what Allah is trying to say, then after understanding it, this is another level of pondering and tadabbur. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Qur'an that أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, that why do they not ponder deeply over the Qur'an? Tadabbur, as we know, dubur is the back of something. So why do they not go really deep into the Qur'an? A very easy way to understand this is the Qur'an has a surface meaning, which you can take maybe from a translation. But from a tafsir, what you take is the amount. Some of us, if we ever attend a tafsir class, you see how much depth there is to a Qur'an, how many different meanings you can take from the Qur'an, how much you can really benefit from the different things which the scholars say about what Allah says in the Qur'an. So these are the different things that we can take. It's like if you're looking at a sea. If you look at the surface, it looks like foam and a bit of water. You don't realize the world that's underneath, an entire universe of people, or not people, of sharks, and whole worlds living underneath. You never imagine that unless you dive in. So this is what the Qur'an gives us the opportunity to do, that to actually fully understand it, you have to dive into the depths of it and appreciate the different things which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us as advice, but also more importantly what Allah tells us to ponder over, and the miracles which come within that. So the linguistic miracles of the Qur'an, the way that we understand how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to ponder over the Qur'an, and even the way certain things are sequenced, all of these things we help benefit from the Qur'an. And one of the most important reasons why we'd read the Qur'an would be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He's made that our duty, that He's asked us, within the Qur'an, that why do these people not think and try and understand the Qur'an? Why do these people not ponder over the Qur'an? And then do these people not think? So when Allah says in the Qur'an, أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ, that why do people not try and think deeply about what key messages Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to give in the Qur'an? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions about the Qur'an Himself that إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَذِكْرَ لِمَنْ كَانَ لَهُ قَلْبٌ, that the spirituality aspect, that within the Qur'an there's definitely a reminder for everyone who's got a heart. Everyone who's got a heart which is open to take the messages of the Qur'an, then in there's benefit for him. So in the Qur'an there'll be a dhikra, there'll be a reminder for those people who want to take a spiritual reminder from the Qur'an. That's one of the key things. And then as well as on the almost the opposite side, when Allah describes the Qur'an, that Qur'an mubin, that Qur'an is very clear and open. It's not something that needs somebody to come and explain. If somebody opens the Qur'an and reads it, then he'll appreciate the meanings and the benefit that he takes. So this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a person, he can take spiritual effect just by reading it, and also by fully understanding it, it clears paths for him, to the extent that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions in the Qur'an that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about how the Jews, they used to change the Qur'an. So they used to have their own book, and they used to change different parts of it. And when they used to change the parts, Allah describes the things which they change as bayyinat, as very clear proofs, very clear evidences. So now, obviously all of this indicates to the fact that we should study the Qur'an. And when we start opening the Qur'an and start understanding it and trying to understand the clear things which Allah says in there, we'll appreciate the kind of messages Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. And that can only really happen when we start studying the Qur'an. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again in the Qur'an, He what?
How do we know the Quran is not changed?
Because of tawatur. So tawatur is a beautiful thing. So generally, if you study history, or if you study a lot of things actually, but especially history, the reason I say history is because when you study history, you have to look at, what do you look at in history?
History.
Yeah.
Or events.
Yeah.
People and events.
Of history.
Importance. Like
Can you use a different word apart from history? Yes, James, seeing as you're the historian. Yeah.
the past. Wow.
The past, absolutely. That's the word we're looking for, isn't it? The past.
History.
And not present, not future. So history is a study of the past. Yeah. So if you use, you really should have appreciated this, but if you use the word which you're trying to define in the definition, then it defeats the point of the definition. Anyway, so so it's a study of the past. Yeah. Now, why that's important is because when something's happened in the past, if it happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago, now we don't really know whether or not it happened. It could just be made up. So how do we know, for example, that World War II happened? Because we have tawatur on World War II. Since World War II, we've got thousands of people in each generation. We've only had a couple of generations anyway, of people telling us that it happened. So now, with certain things in history, sometimes you can go back and you have, tawatur on certain things. Tawatur means basically in every generation, you have such a number of people that it's impossible, number one, for those people to have all agreed on a lie. And number two, it's impossible also for them to have coincidentally agreed on a lie, coincidentally lied. So by chance they can't have lied. Yeah. So it can't be so many people that by chance. For example, if 2 or 3 people can easily make something up by accident at the same time. It's possible. However, and also 4 or 5 people could come together and agree on a lie. So tawatur is when you exceed these numbers. Does that make sense? Okay. So now, when in the Sahaba, with a hadith or with a Qur'an ayah or with anything, with any kind of information, if it reaches tawatur level in the Sahaba, then it's very unlikely that thing will ever lose its authenticity. Does that make sense? Because if 1,000 Sahaba narrate something, companions of the Prophet, and they all say we've heard this from the Prophet, and they pass it down, it's only going to get more, isn't it? It's like nowadays, it's very freely available, most of the information. So it's a hadith discussion generally, but the Qur'an itself, to understand the Qur'an, you compare it with hadith, because we know all hadiths aren't necessarily authentic, because we don't have the authenticity to them. But with the Qur'an, we have this guarantee, because there's always been so many people in each generation. Does that make sense? Make sense? Okay, mashallah. I forgot where I was. Okay, just one more way which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within the Quran describes the Quran, just to finish off that discussion. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas qad ja'atkum maw'idatun min rabbikum. The first thing, maw'idah, an advice. So this is one way we take the Quran. And وَشِفَاءٌ لِمَا فِي الصُّدُورِ, and a cure for everything in the heart. This is why we've got certain websites nowadays. Most of us probably got that viral message on WhatsApp, that you type in an emotion and it'll give you a Quran ayah for that. So now when we have problems in our heart, we have spiritual problems, we have emotional problems, then the Quran is something we can turn to. It'll give us so much solace. And we realize that just by reciting it. And then even names of Allah and du'as that we can take from the Quran, which give us solace from these kind of problems. And the final thing, وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Even right at the beginning of the Quran, Alif Lam Mim ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. So huda, this guidance, is something which we have in the Quran. And then here what he mentions as well is rahmah, that the Quran also is a mercy for the mu'minin. A mercy being that it benefits us in so many different ways. That imagine if we didn't have the Quran, like we wouldn't have something to turn to. And the most important thing is that first point, that is something which comes directly from Allah. The reason scholars of the past would devote their entire lives to the Quran is because it's something we've got the guarantee that once we've guaranteed that it's from Allah, then we've got that understanding that it's not something which is going to be flawed. Every creation of Allah is in some way flawed. Yeah, because even anything which Allah sends to the earth, which is makhluk and created, will have some kind of flaw in it, will have some kind of problem. But if kalamullah, if it's the word of Allah Himself, then that thing will be exempt from any kind of flaw. So now if we have direct access to it, there's so many ways we can benefit from it. That's why it's a rahmah for us, that's why it's a huda, and so many things that we can take. Okay, so that's, that's just some, there's so many more things. I haven't even got through the list which I made, which is very, very concise, just to go through while we're here. But I mean, within the Qur'an, the way Allah describes the Qur'an, for us to benefit from the Qur'an, that list is very, very long. There's so many different things we can say. But if we went through that whole list, you'd all get very bored. Now, by reading the Qur'an, by actually reading the Qur'an, how do we benefit from the Qur'an? So now, the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions in the hadith that الذي يقرأ بالقرآن وهو ماهر به مع السفرة الكرام البررة, that anybody who recites the Qur'an and he's mahir. Mahir means in Urdu?
Expert,
skilled. How do you know?
I'm learning Hindi.
Subhanallah. So none of the, he's from Afghanistan, these two are from Pakistan. No one knew the Urdu word. Okay, anyway. Mahir means expert, skilled. Very good. So if somebody is an expert of the Qur'an, then this person, he is ma'a safaratil kiram. He's with those angels who are kiram, who are very honored, and barara, and are also obedient. So these are the two qualities Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala associates to the angels. If somebody's mahir with Qur'an, he knows how to recite the Qur'an properly. So that's the reward, that he's got the company of the righteous angels. So now this person, obviously by reciting the Qur'an, obviously we know honor comes to that person, and also we know we can expect that person, because of the Qur'an and following the teachings of the Qur'an, he'll become obedient as well. So these are the two qualities. However, the Prophet ﷺ carries on, وَالَّذِي يَقْرَأَهُ وَهُوَ يَشْتَدُّ عَلَيْهِ. If a person recites it and the Qur'an is difficult on him, it's hard for him to recite, it becomes difficult for him to pronounce the words, or it takes him a long time to develop fluency. So you have one person who's very good at reciting, and he's got his reward of being with the angels and the obedient angels. The Prophet ﷺ says there's some people who won't have that ease. So now what's the reward for this person? The Prophet ﷺ says فَلَهُ أَجْرًا. This person, he gets double the reward. So the person who can recite properly, he gets his reward. But a person who can't recite and struggles and tries hard, he gets double the reward of the person who can recite. So this is a very key indication. What we find is, when the hadith come as well, we always find the indication, especially with the Qur'an, of the importance of actually engaging with learning it. So the emphasis is always there on learning. For example, in this hadith, the emphasis is more on the person who learns and tries hard, a lot more than the person who already knows how to read. So that's how we improve ourselves. And then obviously the very famous hadith we mentioned at the beginning, that خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنَ وَعَلَّمَ, that the best of you is the one who ta'allama, who learns the Qur'an first, and then allama. Once a person, you can only get to the second stage once you've been through the whole of the ta'aleem process, once you've engaged in learning and developing fluency and understanding the Qur'an. It's only after that point you can ever try and teach the Qur'an. So the first aim is always to try and learn the Qur'an first and then teach the Qur'an. So then, and also we know in Islam there's the other point, that when we make an intention to do something, we get the reward of the end goal. So for example, if we make an intention to learn the Qur'an and recite it properly, then as long as we take all the means to get to that point of being able to recite really nicely, and we try our best and we spend the time behind it, we put effort behind it, and if need be we put money behind it, and we put sacrifice behind it generally. When we make that sacrifice, then Allah gives the reward of the end goal, even if we don't get there. So if a person was to die on that journey, he would get the reward of having learnt the Qur'an to that level. And these are hadith indicate on the same thing, that the best of you, the Prophet ﷺ indicates, is the one who learns the Qur'an first and then teaches it. So this is what we learn from that hadith. And also, it gives us the inspiration to actually, to some extent, to whatever extent it is, whether it's a big extent, whether we devote our lives to the Qur'an, or whether we on a daily basis take out 5 minutes to try and learn from some kind of source, then that puts us within that group. So the Prophet says, when he says that khayrukum, the best of you is this group, then we get to be in that group just by making a small sacrifice, because we've started learning. So this is the benefits of these ahadith. And also we learn that in reality everyone, as Muslims, we have to learn some part of the Quran. We have to learn how to recite the Quran, and ideally, because it's the book of Allah, there's got to be some kind of aim in our life that long term, I want to fully understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. So now, all of these virtues that come, these help us further. And then in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said that man qara'a harfan min kitabillah falahu hasana, that whoever recites one letter, he has a hasana. And then wal hasana bi ashri amthaliha, and then every one letter which you recite, you'll get 10 times the reward. So for every letter, a person will get 10 rewards. And then the Prophet ﷺ carries on that la aqul alif lam mim harf, that I do not say that alif lam mim is one harf. However, alif is an individual harf, and then lam is an individual harf, and as is mim. So for all three, you'll get 30 rewards. So then this is just almost a physical reward which a person gets for reciting the Qur'an, even without understanding. And then all the other benefits that come with it as well. So this is one of the things that really helps us. And then obviously when we've mastered reciting and we learn it to the ability, we learn reading the Qur'an to the ability where we can read it fluently, then also naturally we want to understand what it is that we're reciting. When we're praying 5 times a day, you want to know what it is that you're saying to Allah 5 times a day. So this is something really important which we try and develop. And it's almost very often ignorance of this, like the failure to appreciate how deep the Qur'an is or how much benefit the Qur'an can give us. This is something which very often drives us away, because if we appreciated the value of the Qur'an and the miraculous nature of the Qur'an and we studied that, then that would always increase our iman. It would always increase our understanding and connection with Allah. But when a person doesn't appreciate that, then it's something like he just doesn't understand why it is that the Qur'an is emphasized so much. Why am I always forced to read the Qur'an? Why am I meant to be reading the Qur'an? So if a person never undertakes a journey to try and understand this, then it's very hard to kind of appreciate that kind of understanding. And one of the things the Qur'an promotes a lot, like we mentioned at the beginning, is thinking clearly, having bayyinat. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He mentions that إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَكْتُمُونَ مَا أَنزَلْنَا مِنَ الْبَيِّنَاتِ وَالْهُدَى. That bayyinat and huda. Bayyinat, clear proofs. Huda, the guidance. So now, there were people from before, talking about Bani Israel and the Jews of before. He said that they were those people who used to hide those things which we revealed. Yeah. So as we know, this is something which at the time of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina, there's obvious examples in certain hadith, but generally, stereotypically speaking, certain scholars would say that this is how the Jews would behave. That they would very often, the scholars would hide the Qur'an, from the average person. So يَكْتُمُونَ مَا أَنزَلْنَا, Allah describes this in the Qur'an, that they hide مَا أَنزَلْنَا, what we revealed, مِنَ الْبَيِّنَاتِ, from the clear evidences, a very simple thing, and huda. But now this is something we accuse the Jews of doing. But unfortunately nowadays we find it so prevalent within our own culture. As Muslims, we've done exactly the same thing. Like how many people from the average Muslims would know how to recite the Qur'an or what the Qur'an's on about? When he prays 5 times a day, how many of them actually know what they're saying? It's just become hidden, and very often the people who are meant to be teaching this, unfortunately, don't emphasize on the teaching of the Qur'an enough. So we find ourselves committing the same crime which Allah mentioned the Jews for, because that was a problem which was in their society, and then unfortunately we find the same problem within our own society. So it's something that we have to try and eradicate, firstly by educating ourselves on the Qur'an, and also trying to, when we learn something, we try and teach it to others, and we encourage other people to try and understand the Qur'an as much as we can. And I mean, within our society we see many problems. But one of the main reasons you'll see a lot of people turn up for the Friday prayer and on Eid, and then not really be interested in Islam, is also for this same kind of reason, that Islam's value has not been kind of advertised to them. So if we don't advertise the Qur'an, if we don't appreciate the Qur'an, the value of the Qur'an, then Islam becomes kind of a hollow, empty kind of thing. It's just a load of rituals that we do. So in Ramadan we'll fast a bit and then we'll give some charity, because otherwise everyone will ask why we haven't given charity. Or sometimes we give charity so that people think that, wow, he's donated so much. And then we'll pray so that we keep in touch with the community. We'll make sure our kids know how to read the Qur'an, because otherwise, as we say in Pakistani, that's besti, isn't it? So otherwise these are the only reasons we do things. So then the whole point of the Qur'an, which was tadabbur, which was to ponder over it and to properly, deeply think about it, and you look at the bayyinat, look at the evidences which the Qur'an provides, all of that will be lost. And then when Allah talks about the Qur'an in itself as a point of beauty, as something which you should value, He says that أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِهِمْ أَنَّ أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابِ يُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ. He addresses the Prophet ﷺ. He says that, is it not enough for them? أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِهِمْ. Is it not enough for the Muslimin, and in this case addressing the mushrikeen, that is not enough for them. The fact that أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكَ, we have revealed to you, addressing the Prophet ﷺ, we revealed to you a book which can be recited on them. And directly, now the way that this is addressed is it not enough for them? As if the Qur'an itself is something which is more than sufficient for somebody to understand. So if somebody comes to the Qur'an with an open heart and tries to understand it, and then fails to understand, then he has an excuse in that. But if somebody ignores this whole book and then makes excuses about why they don't understand Islam, then he has no right to make excuses, because this thing in itself was meant to be sufficient for him. So unfortunately, we find within our society this is generally the problem. So it's upon all of us, mashallah, as we're all so highly educated, to go to our communities, inshallah, and we try and promote this, the importance of, maybe we don't become teachers of the Qur'an, but we at least alert people to the fact that the study of the Qur'an is important to a slightly higher level that we currently have in our society. It's not just about going and learning how to speak. It's also more important, not just how to read, it's not just about reading the Qur'an. And there's a lot more to that. There's so many other things that are there. And also, one very important thing that we learn from the Qur'an is if we fully understand the Qur'an, it'll actually change our whole perspective on life, because it will change what we focus on. What does the Qur'an focus on? 3 main things. Who remembers? So 3 main things the Qur'an focuses on. Number 1, Tawheed, the oneness of Allah. Number 2 is Risala, and number 3 is Akhirah. So generally it focuses on the oneness of Allah, that how a person, his being who he worships, and the person who controls what he does, the being who controls what he does, or who decides what he should do and shouldn't do, is always going to be Allah. So any other thing of the world would never dictate what he does. And this is what we find in our lives. Sometimes we let other things dictate what we should and shouldn't do. We let what people say sometimes dictate what we should and shouldn't do. We let money sometimes decide the amount of money that a certain career path will let us get. We let that dictate what we should and shouldn't do. So it varies, and we let other things dictate other than Allah. That's the first thing, Tawheed. The Risala, the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that success is in his way. And finally, we see Akhirah. Now, Akhirah is something which the average person in the world will never think about. If a person is living his life normally, even us, while we're living our life, how often naturally in our life do we think of the hereafter? Or do we think of even where we came from? So now this is what the Qur'an, so many times the Qur'an focuses on how Allah created human beings, and how Allah created the world for us to live in, and how Allah created us for a purpose. How many different times does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talk about these kind of things? And also, as well as that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He also discusses how He created the hereafter, and why He sent us in the world, and how in the hereafter there'll be. Now, if we live in the world as normal people and we ignore the Qur'an, naturally we will never think about the hereafter. So the Qur'an completely changes our focus. It allows us to focus on the real issue, because so generally, if somebody doesn't have an end, if he doesn't have a real something to focus on, they'll make whatever the means is the end. Because somebody can never have an aim or an objective at the end of a tunnel, then they'll make the tunnel itself and everything within the tunnel their aim, and they'll make that the end. They'll make that what they focus on, because they can't see anything beyond that. So now the Qur'an takes our focus beyond the little life that we've got, 60, 70 years we're in, and it takes it way beyond that. So you focus on something which is a lot more important. And also before as well, very often we don't focus on where we came from. When we think of what we were, how we were born, and how we grew up, and the dependency we had, it creates a lot of humility within us. That what am I as a person, and how dependent I was on other human beings, and how dependent I was to be saved from so many problems. And then we realize the value which we've been given because of the blessings which Allah has given us. So it creates humility within us. And this is something which the Qur'an again reminds us of, where we came from and where we're going to. And these are really, really important, because these help focus us a lot. And finally, there's one scene on the day of Qiyamah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions this in the Qur'an. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is speaking, and the scene is depicted of the day of Qiyamah. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he is quoted. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قال الرسول, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam will say, Ya Rab, that he will address Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of Qiyamah. And he will say that إِنَّ قَوْمِ اتَّخَذُوا هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ مَهْجُورًا, that my people, they took this Qur'an and اتَّخَذُوهُ مَهْجُورًا, they took it and they left it behind. Hijrah means, so mahjur as in from hijrah, to leave behind, to migrate away from it. And not just leave it a little bit. When you do hijrah from a land, when the Muslims left Mecca, they left everything there. They left all their possessions and their houses, and they had to leave it all behind. And they didn't have like, we're going to come back after 6 years. They never had that in their mind. It was just to leave everything. When they went to Abyssinia, same thing. So generally hijrah means to leave something completely. So the Prophet ﷺ make this accusation against certain people of his ummah on the day of Qiyamah, that my people, they left the Qur'an way behind, and they completely forgot about it. And almost as we know, the day of judgment, so where judgments will be made, so you'll have Allah as a judge, and there'll be evidences presented, and that's how we'll be judged on that day. So the Prophet ﷺ, if he's the barrister, and he brings the Qur'an as an evidence, and then he accuses a group of people of forgetting about the Qur'an and leaving it way behind, and he's presenting this argument. So it's a very strong argument. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in the Qur'an to get our attention back to the Qur'an, that we realize how important it is for us to focus to some extent on the Qur'an and value the Qur'an. And as we know, the Qur'an is an intercessor. It performs intercession in different ways. So from different ahadith we find this. The Prophet ﷺ, he mentions in one ahadith that اقرأ القرآن فإنه يأتي يوم القيامة شفيئا لأصحابه. That make sure you recite the Qur'an, because it will come on the day of Qiyamah as a intercessor for the people of it. So whoever makes himself a person of the Qur'an will intercede on his behalf. And another more detailed hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that يؤتى يوم القيامة بالقرآن وحده الذين كانوا يعملون به. That on the day of Qiyamah, the Qur'an and the people who acted on the Qur'an will be brought. So separately, the Prophet says the Qur'an will come, and then those people who acted on the Qur'an, they will also be brought. And then he explains that if you acted on the Qur'an in the dunya, then تقدمه سورة البقرة وآل عمران, that at the front of the Qur'an, so remember the Qur'an was coming as well. So at the front of the Qur'an, Surah Baqarah and Surah Al Imran will both intercede to hajjan. So if a person fulfills the rights of these two surahs, these will, as surahs, they will intercede on this on this person's behalf. And in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, إن الله يرفع بهذا الكتاب أقواما ويضع به آخرين. It's a very famous hadith that because of the Qur'an, Allah will benefit certain people. He will raise certain people. Certain people's statuses will be uplifted, and certain people yada, because of their failure to look after the Qur'an, they will be left behind. So this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes these things. And also finally, one thing which you learn about the benefits of the Qur'an is when Allah mentions in the Qur'an وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ, that come together and all grasp the hablillah. This hablillah, the rope of Allah. Most people believe that this indicates on the Qur'an itself. The Qur'an is the one thing which unifies everyone. That because when we take and all stick as a Muslim ummah, if we all stuck to the messages of the Qur'an and the things which the Qur'an teaches, then there'd be unity within the Muslims. There wouldn't be something to divide. So this is what the Qur'an calls towards, to unite on the messages of the Qur'an. So I make dua Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives me and all of us inshallah the ability to understand, appreciate and act upon what has been said. Any questions are welcome inshallah.
So
Reset it now.